Hello and welcome to the memory card. It's weird to think that the PlayStation 3 came out over 10 years ago at this point. It seems like just yesterday that system came out. So in light of that, I figured I should talk about one of the early games for the system that helped define the platform and define Sony and its developer Naughty Dog for the past 10 years. Naughty Dog is not really the same developer that I knew growing up that made Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter, despite having the same name. The tone of their games are just very different nowadays, and all that started with Uncharted Drake's Fortune for the PlayStation 3.
Oh, hold on. Hold on, kid. I'm not as young as I used to be.
Yeah, you weren't too old for that little barmaid in Lima, were you?
Ha! Well, that was different. Although I must admit, equally as strenuous.
Well, hang in there, old-timer. We're just about there.
Uncharted Drake's Fortune was made by Naughty Dog, the same studio that brought us Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation 1, Jak and Daxter on the PS2, and then later on the PlayStation 3, they made The Last of Us. For a while, Naughty Dog set the precedent that there would be a new trilogy from them each generation that would be distinct to the platform, like with the Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter games, like I said. But this changed during the PS3's lifespan. The studio made the Uncharted trilogy, but they also made a new IP, The Last of Us, all of which will eventually be covered on this channel. This game came out in 2007, and you can definitely tell by the graphics and the gameplay. It served to show how much more powerful the PS3 was than the PS2, but there are aspects that haven't aged quite as well, to me at least. For instance, the characters all kind of look like they have plastic skin, which looks strange.
What a warm and homey place.
Aside from some low-res textures here and there, and some texture pop-ins, and the shadows need some anti-aliasing, the presentation is really good, especially for 2007.
No, it wasn't Drake. Check this out. Looks like the Spanish got here before he did. What the hell, Sully?
Nate, I'm not looking for
The Uncharted games are often compared to the Tomb Raider games and the Indiana Jones movies, and it's a fair and accurate comparison. The Uncharted trilogy on the PS3 are basically summer blockbusters in video game form. The production values are very high, and the acting is really good, and there are some great set pieces that make for some memorable fun, but it is all very safe. Most of what is in this game was already done in the Tomb Raider series, and in the Indiana Jones movies, or in the Mummy movies from the early 2000s. Now, to be fair, Uncharted is much better than most Tomb Raider games, aside from the recent reboot and the sequel to that one. In the numbered Uncharted games, you play as the treasure hunter Nathan Drake, who travels the world alongside his best friend and mentor, Victor Sullivan, though he's usually just called Sully. Nathan Drake is introduced fairly well in this game, but he is made much more likable in the sequel and the following games after that. In this game, he's mostly smarmy and cocky, but he is still a fun character. Also, something weird about Nathan Drake is that he's simultaneously extremely lucky and seemingly cursed. Everything he's under is constantly getting shot at, and he's falling all the time from things collapsing that he's walking on or climbing on, and yet he never gets hurt too bad. Just kind of funny how that works out with his plot armor. And in the first game here, Nathan Drake and Sully are in search of El Dorado with the help of a reporter, Elena Fisher, and she's a really fun character that gets introduced very well in this game and only gets better with the sequels, with a lot more layers getting added to her and just more time to develop her character. The plot in Uncharted 1 is fairly predictable, and when you play a lot of the Uncharted games back to back like I have, you start to notice a lot of them follow the same beats and have a pretty distinct formula to them. A lot of the set pieces are really interesting and fun, but get predictable over time. You'll know that that bridge is going to collapse, or that car is going to wreck, or the thing you're climbing on up a cliff or wherever is going to collapse from a mile away. But for the most part, it is a fun ride. And throughout the game, I have to say, with Uncharted 1, I got the feeling that I would have been much more impressed and had more fun with the original PS3 release back when it came out in 2007. Naughty Dog is renowned for their high production quality in their games, and that's been the case since the PlayStation 1 with the Crash Bandicoot games, and that's still reflected in the Uncharted series. However, it's apparent that with Uncharted 1, this was Naughty Dog's first foray into this kind of game, because there's a fair amount of the gameplay and control decisions that did not age well. And those were thankfully improved and fixed in the sequels. Because, you know, the Jak and Daxter games have pretty fluid controls aside from the vehicles, and Crash controlled fairly well, but for some reason, ever since Uncharted 1, Naughty Dog controls have all felt pretty sluggish to me, and the controls don't feel quite as responsive as they should be. I'm not sure if it's the engine that they use or what. Now, all this stuff was improved in Uncharted 2 in every game they've made since then, but all of them still have that kind of sluggishness to them. And it's the worst in Uncharted 1, because it hasn't been refined yet. A lot of times the climate controls also didn't really feel right to me. Like, Nathan wouldn't jump when he was supposed to, or when I would push the analog stick in a certain way to climb, to progress. It didn't feel like it was as responsive as it should have been, or sometimes it just didn't feel like it made sense which way to go. All this sort of stuff added up to make the climbing sections fairly frustrating for me, which honestly I have similar gripes for most of the Assassin's Creed games as well with their climbing sections.
Just keep your head down. These guys aren't messing around.
Now the climbing is functional, but it's just not as smooth as I think it should be. But the biggest problem I have with this original release on the PS3 is the combat. The vast majority of the combat sections after the introductory level all go on way longer than they should, and it really kills the pacing of this game. And this is also early into the glut of third-person cover-based shooters, and it shows. The common problems of bullet sponge enemies and enemies that are superhumanly accurate with their grenades to get you out of cover are all really annoying. And also, since this is the first game and they haven't refined things yet, the shooting just feels fairly subpar, honestly. All of it just sort of adds up to a lot of minor annoyances that just start to build up. Now, Uncharted 1 is not a bad game, do not get me wrong on this. It just has a lot of little problems that add up alongside some bigger design flaws that I don't think aged well just because it was a product of its time. I definitely think this is the weakest entry of the Uncharted series by far. Thankfully, the rest of the series improves dramatically, and a lot of the Uncharted games are actually really great games that I recommend. It's just this original PS3 Uncharted 1 that I don't think ages all that well and think can mostly be skipped. And thankfully that's not too hard because the Uncharted games are mostly pretty episodic. It's kind of like the Indiana Jones movies in that way, where you don't have to watch all three of them in sequential order to really get the story of the Indiana Jones movies. They're all pretty self-contained, and that's the same in the Uncharted games. Each game is distinct within itself. There's characters that come back, and playing all the games and seeing all the stories and get you more invested in the characters and let you get to know them more, but it's not necessary. Now I know I might have sounded a bit harsh in this review, and that's just because, well, I don't think the original release of Uncharted 1 of the PlayStation 3 really lives up to its premise and the promise that this game had. It was impressive for the time, but it just didn't really age all that well for me. There's a lot of little things that add up to just bug me. And part of what bums me out about this is that I love stories like this and adventures like this, like the Indiana Jones movies and the Tomb Raider games. I love stories of treasure hunters and adventurers going off to exotic locations and finding lost cities and treasures and stuff like that. I eat that stuff up. But just those little things keep me from enjoying this like I should, and that really bothers me. But thankfully, you can just skip out on the original release and just get the Uncharted collection on the PlayStation 4. It's got all the Uncharted trilogy from the PlayStation 3 all on one disc, and it features not only visual improvements but gameplay improvements, especially for the first game. It makes it much more playable and fun. I actually really enjoy Uncharted 1 in the collection. But I'll get into more detail on that when I do my eventual review of the collection itself. But before then, I don't want to talk about the original releases. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the memory card.